Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Din and Daf. This is Alana Steinhain, and this week we are going to talk about Parshanut, specifically the way that the rabbis read Halakha from Torah. The reason why I want to talk about that this week is because on Daf Samach Vav Amud Aleph in Sanhedrin, we find a principle that I think really pushes us to ask, how do Chazal really read the pshat of the Torah? And that principle is Imeno inyan leX, tneu inyan ley. If something could not be interpreted or need not be interpreted for its own context, interpret it as something that's bringing something in from a different context. And the example that we have is actually trying to figure out where the azhara for not cursing your parents comes from. We know that there's a punishment for cursing your parents in the Torah, but we do not know where the azhara comes from, the warning not to do it. And so what the Gemara does is the Gemara says, well, we do have a pasuk that says, Elohim lo tekaleh, that you're not allowed to curse judges. And the Gemara basically says, we know already that you're not allowed to curse people who are statistically extraordinary, like a judge, because we know lo tekalel cheresh. We know you're not allowed to curse someone. There's already an azara that you're not allowed to curse someone who is deaf and mute. So we don't need it to say anything about judges. So therefore, Elohim lamali, why does it have to say don't curse judges? If it's not teaching you something about its own meaning judges, because you would have already known that, Tneu inyan laviv. Say that that is the azhara for not cursing your father. Now, you look at this and you say to yourself, well, did Chazal think that that was the pshat of the pasuk? And where does this concept even come from? So something I want to do today is I want to ask three overall questions. I want to understand where do Chazal's hermeneutical rules, meaning rules with which they interpret Torah halachically, where did those principles come from? Second, what are those principles actually doing? Are they actually deriving law or just upholding laws that Chazal already know? And three, how does Chazal look at Torah and its language in general? So I want to start with the fact that we know from the Tosefta in Sanhedrin, Perek Zayin, that Hillel Hazakin gave us the first 7 of our Midot Torah Nidreshet Bahen, the first 7 hermeneutical principles, rules by which the Torah is going to be read rabbinically. So let's take a look. Some of them will look quite familiar to you. There's Kal V'chomer, there's Gezerah Shava, when the same term is used or the same phrase. There's Binyan Av, setting a general type based on Katuv Echad, one pasuk. Binyan Av Mishnei Ketuvim, you're setting a general rule based on, or precedent based on 2 different psukim, etc., etc. So that's Hillel. And then when we look in the Sifra, which is the Midrash Halacha on Vayikra, it opens with the 13 principles of Rabbi Yishmael. Instead of having 7, Rabbi Yishmael gives us 13. And some of those 13 are the same as Hillel's. I also want to add that Rabbi Yossi Haglili elsewhere is credited with having 32 principles specifically for reading narrative in the Torah. And our principle that I mentioned from today of Im eno inyan leX, tneu inyan ley, if it can't be used to explain X, which is what we would have expected it to do, then it should explain Y, which comes from somewhere else. That's actually on the list of Rabbi Yossi Haglili. But interesting to consider that that emerges in the instinct of how to read narrative, but it's used here in terms of how to read halakha. So let's ask our first question. Where do Chazal's hermeneutical principles come from? So you have 2 basic schools of thought. You have the Rambam, who represents a pretty thoroughgoing medieval school of thought, and I think also represents some midrashim that we see now and again. And that is what he expresses here in his introduction to the Pirush HaMishnah. If there are things that Yehoshua did not hear from Moshe in terms of law, he would use analogy in order to derive those laws. Using the 13 principles that were given to Moshe at Sinai. Meaning 13 principles that Rabbi Yishmael cites, those were given to Moshe at Sinai. Now, if you say that, you have to suggest that probably Hillel's principles, the 7, were also given at Sinai, right? So there are questions that arise there, but suffice it to say, if you think that the Yud Gimel Midot were given at Sinai, then their authority, despite the fact that they're rather idiosyncratic and may lead to very idiosyncratic readings of Torah that are decontextualized, they have a lot of authority because they come from Sinai. They come from God, actually, right? That's one school of thought. Another school of thought is represented by the Nitziv, right? Tziv being a more recent figure in history. He has the following to say on a pasuk in Vayikra that interestingly changes the terminology or the verb that's usually used to describe the requirement to keep hukim, and the Nitziv is going to use that as an anchor for his perspective on rabbinic exegesis. Number 5, Va'asitem et chukotai ve'et mishpatai tishmeru va'asitem otam v'shavtem al haaretz levetach. You should do my chukim, and you should keep my mishpatim and do them. Now it's interesting, the Nitziv points out, B'chol ha'psukim shekadom lezeh k'tiv u'shmartem et chukotai ve'et mishpatai. In psukim like this, usually the term u'shmartem is used. You should keep chukotai rather than va'asitem et chukotai. You should make them. But here, the Torah changes its language for a deep reason. Tikvar be'arnu bekama mekomot, we've already explained, tikvar be'arnu, we've already explained, the b'chol makom sheikdim hakatuv chukim lemishpatim, maybe bekama mekomot, not sure, that in every place, maybe in most places, where, or some places, where the Torah puts chukim before mishpatim, mashma'o chukim klalim sha'torah nidreshet u'mitpareshet bahem. What the Torah means by chukim is not following the law, but actually it refers to the principles, the rules by which the Torah is to be understood and explained. Umishpatim hachakira hayotze miklalim. And what are mishpatim? Mishpatim are what emerge from using those principles, right? So what that means is actually you are supposed to make principles for reading the Torah and being able to keep the law. The Nitziv here is credited with suggesting that actually Yud Gimel Midot, they're not from Sinai. These are actually tools and ways of reading and rules that the rabbis came up with. Now, how did they come up with them is an important question, but I do think it's interesting that he says, "V'hu al pi iyun mechudash or mechadash b'chol dor v'dor." Every generation comes up with new principles, right? So this is kind of interesting, and I don't know exactly, is it possible that because they know what the halacha is going to be, they then back into the Yud Gimel Midot for reading them in, or are they coming up with the Yud Gimel Midot on their own or from surrounding culture that these are our reading practices during this time? Not sure, to be honest, but I do think this represents a different strand of thought, which is these don't come from Sinai, they come from somewhere else, okay? And that you might imagine, you might say, oh, well, not sure then how you know how authoritative those are going to be. What gives that its authority? And I think that brings us to our next question, which is, where does the law actually come from, right? Because if we want to know what the samchut, what the authority is of the 13 principles, if we think they're from Sinai, then presumably whatever you learn from them is also considered to have that same samchut. But if we think that the rabbis came up with them either on their own through cultural influence, things like that, then is the law really coming from there, or are they just using those klalim to uphold law that we already know? So it turns out that there's a machloket about that question too. Is midrash supposed to be yotzer halacha? Is it supposed to be creating halacha? Or is midrash just mekayem halacha? Is midrash just, and again, I mean halakhic midrash, is midrash just upholding halachot that they already knew through their traditions that had been passed down, right? So the Ralbag thinks the latter is true, right? Says, V'hinei b'vei'ur hamitzvot v'ashorashim, asher mehem yatzu kol dinehem, asher hitbaru b'chachmot hatalmudiyot. He says, and explaining the mitzvot and the roots from which all of the dinim came that are explained in Talmudic wisdom, lo yeh b'minhagenu b'chol ha'mekomot l'smoch otam השורשים על המקומות אשר סמכו אותם חכמי התלמוד באחד מי"ג מידות לפי מנהגם. He says, I'm not always going to explain mitzvot or their shorashim by connecting them to the psukim that Chazal connected them to. וזה שהם סמכו אלו הדברים האמיתיים המקובלים להם במצוות התורה לפסוקים ההם, and the fact that Chazal chose to actually lean their laws that they had already received, the fact that they tried to lean those on psukim, lihiyot kidmut remez v'asmachta lidvarim hem. That's only a hint. The fact that they connected to a pasuk, that's only a hint and an asmachta. All they're doing is they already have the halacha and they're trying to authorize it within the psukim, but it doesn't really come from the psukim themselves, right? לא שיהיה דעתם שיהיה מוצא אלו הדינים מאלו המקומות, or מוציא אלו הדינים מאלו המקומות. Not that they're actually extracting law from these places in the Torah. Why does the Ralbag seem to think this? That the purpose of Midrash Halacha is only lekayem, what we already know. כי כבר יוכל האדם להפוך כל דיני התורה בכמו אלו הקשים עד שאפשר בהם לטהר את השרץ, כמו שזכרו זכרונו לברכה. He says, because using the Gimel Midot, you could say anything. You could be metayr, something that is an epitome of tumah, like a sheretz, which Chazal themselves say that you could do, right? Meaning you could use the Gimel Midot to read very surprising things and the opposite of the meaning of the Torah, right? Okay, so why did they choose if the psukim themselves and their Parshanut are not where they're getting it from? Why did they choose to even connect them to the psukim? אבל נסמוך אותם אל פשטי הפסוקים אשר אפשר שיצאו הדינים האלו מהם, כי בזה תתיישב הנפש יותר. Says, because that makes people calmer, that it's connected to the Torah in some way. But that is not where these laws come from. They are laws that were passed down. That's what the Ralbag has to say. Now, the Malbim says something very different. Again, more recent thinker. If you want to read more about the Malbim, by the way, I gave you a link to Rabbanit Abigail Rak, Zichron HaLebracha. She wrote a really wonderful explanation of the kinds of things the Malbim was actually working against and having a polemic with in some of the things that he wrote about how to understand Torah. But the Malbim says he's very upset. Kasher sha'alnu l'dor rishon When I asked the earlier generation, what did they tell me? Ra'inu ki milibam yotziu milim shaktuvim hamuva'im l'raya el halachot him rak tzionim ba'asmachtot. He says, I heard something that they made up, which is basically the scripture that Chazal turned to as evidence for their halachot. They're actually mostly symbolic. They're just an asmachta. That's not really where the halachot are coming from. Asher hitzivu lahem tzionim le'urir hazikaron. It may even be a memorization tactic, a good way to remember. If you can connect it to pasuk X, you'll remember halacha Y. But v'ikarei halachot hayu mekubalot bi'adam ba'al peh. The truth is, the essence of the halachot were things that they already had gotten passed down to them ba'al peh. And the Malbim disagrees with this vehemently. No way. They always ask, where does something come from? And they answer from pasuk so and so. And then they ask a challenge. But that pasuk can't be the source because it's used for XYZ Breita that tells you a different halacha, right? Or it's used for XYZ halacha that's mentioned in a different Breita. They answer, they challenge, and they do all this pill back and forth. The rabbis are not going to ask all these back and forth kashas about a pasuk fitting or not fitting if the whole reason for the pasuk is actually just symbolic, and that's not really the source of this halacha, right? When there's an argument, each person brings a pasuk to prove their point. And they push away the other side's point or evidence. They're so exacting and nuanced. Right? The psukim themselves are what they use to knock things down, to build things up, to decide between two positions. He says, no, the evidence for a halacha comes from scripture itself. That's where the halachot are actually planted. Gam shorasho or gam shurshu, right? V'lo ba'u kishoresh me'eretz tzia. They're not like a shoresh that's in a dry desert wilderness, right? These are roots that emerge, from the ground of Torah shebichtav, right? And he goes further because you might say, what do you mean these halachot come out of the psukim? But a lot of the ways that Chazal interpret the psukim go against the pshat. So what does he say? Hadrush, you should know that the interpretation, hu hapshat hapashut, the interpretation is the actual pshat. B'chol divrei Chazal muchrachim umutba'im be'omek halashon uvisodei hasafa ha'ivriya. He says, you should know what Chazal find that looks like drash to you, and it looks like it's not the pshat, that's the real true pshat. Yeru ha'ivrim ki yesh pninim aseret monim. Jews should know that there are real riches here. Yeru ha'ivrim ki yesh neshek uklei krav neged ze'evei ze'evei Erev, the Erev Rav. I'm not sure what the Ze'evim are, but clearly there's a polemic here, right? There is something to use. There are tools to use against the wolves who come against us, or the Erev Rav, the mixed multitudes, right? He's talking about Jews who don't really believe in Torah Shabbat Peh anymore. Neged kol kofer, upoker, umakrish, umevaker, right? It's like, I have answers. There are tools. There are weapons to fight against this, right? Et cetera, right? And what he's going to try to do is he's going to try to show how the Jirash of Chazal is really pshat. And these midrashim are midrashim yotzrim, right? The midrash is actually being used to create the halakha, not the other way around, right? So two prominent schools of thought. But I actually think it might be useful to think then about the question of how Chazal really saw the Torah and read the Torah. Because, okay, if Chazal get the Yud Gimel Mitot, they've been passed down, and so it's almost like the Torah is not really Dibra Torah Kilshon Ben Adam. The Torah doesn't speak the way that we speak. The Torah has its own rules, right? So if you think that's from Sinai, then okay, I understand how you're going to think that the drash is the pshat. But if you don't think that's from Sinai, then why can you read in that way? So then maybe you're forced to say, well, the Midrash Halacha is not actually creating the law. It's only used to uphold laws that you already know, right? So these are our options so far. I'm going to think about an additional option that actually Dr. Avi Sagi and I were talking about this, and he really opened my eyes to this way of thinking or thinking about it through this maslul, kind of through this pathway. Now, it's interesting. We could really ask the question, what does Chazal think about the Torah and how it speaks? And there's the Ramban in his introduction to his Pirush on the Torah. And I understand that this is coming from a more mystical sensibility. It's interesting to see the way that the Ramban talks about the Torah. Okay? Od yesh biyadenu kabbalah shel emet, ki kol haTorah kula shmotav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We have a Kabbalah that all of the Torah is God's names. Shehatevot mitchalkot l'shemot be'inyan echad. They can be broken up into God's names. Ki'ilu tachshov al derech mashal. Here's a kind of example. Ki pasuk breshit yitchalek l'tevot acherot. Right? Maybe the pasuk of Breshit bara Elokim could be broken up differently. Kigon berosh yitbara Elokim. Right? The Kol HaTorah came. Torah is all like that, right? And this is very interesting because what the Ramban is describing here, and again, I understand that it's mystical, but what the Ramban is describing here is he's describing looking at Torah, certainly not Dibra Kilshon Ben Adam, right? He's describing looking at Torah as just an ongoing sequence of God's names, right? What if instead of taking this mystically, and I'm not saying instead of taking the Ramban mystically, but instead of taking this kind of approach mystically of, well, the Torah is fundamentally mysterious in a mystical kind of way, maybe it's possible that when Chazal looked at the Torah, they looked at it and said, it's full of potential. And it actually contains within it not just pshat, but potential. And it's kind of an ever-flowing ma'ayan, you might think, right? Kind of an ever-flowing spring of meaning. And if that's the case, then you may not be completely bound by the pshat. And you also may not have to argue that the only way something has teeth, that something has real authority, is if the Yud Gimel Midot came from Sinai. It's an interesting way to think, meaning that they might have looked at Torah and said, Torah just has more, just deeper layers of meaning that are possible. And that's okay. That can be read as pshat. Now, is that something that they would only apply to Torah? Is that something that's an influence of their culture? Where are they getting that idea from? Not clear. But I think it's in some ways more intriguing than the question of whether they think they're being Mekayem mitzvot that they already have or they're being Yotzer new ones, is to actually ask, well, when you look at something and you really say, Im eno inyan legufo, tneu inyan lemekalel aviv or leaviv, like, are you really saying that you think that's pshat? I think the answer, according to this, would be it's not that it's pshat, but that its potential is latent in Torah. And what does it look like to see Torah as latent with potential? Obviously, slippery slope, all these different questions that it opens up, but it's kind of intriguing. It's intriguing to think about. I've given you a few links for people who want to think more about these issues. One is a link to Rav Amnon Bazak's book called Nitzchuni Banai. It's a wonderful book where I took a lot of these sources from, actually, where he's basically trying to understand what are Chazal doing when they do Midrash Halacha, whether it's in the Gemara or it's in Midrash Halacha or wherever it's found, and how should people who believe in the Masorah, people who are bound by the way that Chazal read Halacha, how should they understand what Chazal think they were doing, including in places like ayin tachat ayin, shein tachat shein, where Chazal say that it's compensation of money as opposed to somebody getting their eye knocked out as their punishment. The other thing I gave you is I wrote a chapter for the Oxford Companion to Jewish Law on a trend that we see generally in rabbinic interpretation throughout the ages. And that trend is you read very closely, meaning you notice every vav, you notice every et, you notice every word, and yet you use that to read very decontextually, right? Imenu inyan legufo, tneu inyan le'aviv, right? Like that is a very extreme example of that. And I trace that from Chazal reading Torah and Tanakh, to the way the Gemara reads the Mishnah, to the way the Tosfot reads the Gemara, and ultimately even to the way the Briskers try to come up with their Chakirot. Because this really does become a major aspect of our Parshanut, that we pay close attention to each and every situation. And yet sometimes the resolution that we come up with, because of the unity of the literature that we're looking at, we end up coming up with things that don't necessarily meet the pshat, but are, as some would call, turning a grain of sand that was an irritant into a pearl. Thanks for learning with me, everybody. See you next time.